Well, hello, everyone. Welcome again to a Victims of Crime episode. We are here with Ryan and Brian from Undertaking the Podcast. I always point as if I know where I'm pointing at, but it's never the right way when the video comes out. But we got Ryan and Brian from Undertaking the Podcast, and we have John Hill, a funeral director and embalmer, and a teacher. You teach at, which school do you teach at?
At Fayetteville Technical Community College. I'm an adjunct professor there for the embalming labs and restorative art labs.
So he knows a few things. So today we are going to dive into another true crime story. And what we do is we touch on a true crime. We talk about some hypothetical caring for the deceased in these situations. None of us have taken care of any of the people in any of the stories that we talk about. It's more just our personal experiences caring for people who have died in some of the similar ways. This one is very much out of our ballpark of anything we really have handled, but somebody just requested this 2 days ago, and I said, yep, we're going to do it. So we are talking about the Jonestown Massacre. So the People's Temple Agricultural Product, which is the full name of this place, also known as Jonestown. It was a little settlement in Guyana established by the People's Temple, which was founded by Jim Jones. And you guys were saying he was from Indiana?
Yeah, literally right down the road, not a half hour.
Frightening. Now, this was the largest mass casualty event until 9/11.
Oh, really?
And so, and this happened back in the 70s, in 78. Do you guys remember at all the number, death total? I mean,
900, wasn't it?
How much?
900.
It was close to 900. 918 people died in this event. And it stemmed after a politician had visited and was murdered by the group. And then all of a sudden, everybody killed themselves because Jim Jones said to do it. 70 or more individuals were injected with poison, and over a third of the victims were minors. So the vat of the substance that they all either ingested or were injected with was tranquilizers, potassium cyanide, and potassium chloride. And it was mixed with flavored Kool-Aid, which is where the drink the Kool-Aid phrase came from, which
we got to correct this, Kari.
What?
They used Flavor Aid.
Flavor Aid packets, yes.
This says Kool-Aid got a bad rap here.
Oh, we don't want the big drink guy to
That's
get
right.
a bad rap.
Exactly.
It was Flavor Aid packets,
Facts
but
are facts.
it became the phrase drink the Kool-Aid. Kind of like Kleenex, and it's not always Kleenex, it's facial tissue, kind of like calling everything that's a Kool-Aid type substance Kool-Aid. That's how I view it. I don't know. But so, and a few people did die by gunshot, which Jim Jones took the wuss way out and was shot in the head. So, which I think is wussy of him when the rest of them are like convulsing and dying in these horrible ways from the cyanide.
Yeah. If I could jump in on this, Ryan and I recently had a listener to the show, Undertaking the Podcast, ask us to do a show on this. And
cool.
It's been a crazy type of year. So I've started to put in some work. So I'm so glad I didn't miss this one tonight because I've been crazy at the funeral home. But I can talk a little bit about it. I just kind of want to preface it this way. It really started out as something good. At least the idea was good. It was very kind of a socialist message that all people being equal, we can all put our own efforts in, but I can't remember the exact term, but it's those by their efforts give to those, who can't. And it was something in the time frame was it wasn't segregated at all. It was very open to all types of different people. And it was something that the community at large was lacking, and this place offered that. So we thought, or so they thought, unfortunately. So it did give this grand utopia kind of socialist worldview of like, hey, we're all going to go live together. We're going to go in this place. People won't bother us. We can all develop and grow together and grow these families. And it really turned out not to be that at all, unfortunately. But the idea behind it was really, really something that people could latch onto even to today in our time. It's very similar to some of the messaging we hear right now. So I wanted to get my little bit on that, but y'all can go ahead there.
Oh, you're good. Yeah, it was a very standalone, out in the middle of the jungle, essentially, I think is what it said. And they had animals, they had their crops, they had all their own stuff. So they really didn't need to rely on anybody. And it wasn't until reports kept coming back that people wanted out that they went and investigated. And then a few people tried to leave, and then this whole thing ensued. And then it all went very south very quickly with that. So the aftermath of all of this, so this all transpired back, like I said, in November of 1978. And so they found all these bodies. You've got 918 bodies, which I can't imagine that magnitude. I sent you guys a link to it, the Time magazine article that had a lot of photos where there's literally just bodies upon bodies upon bodies everywhere. And then they were there in position for days in the heat and in the jungle and just decaying and decomposing while they had to work on trying to get everybody removed and deal with these bodies. And that's kind of one of the big thing is the Guyanese authorities said, we want no part in this. We don't want to do any autopsies. We don't want anything. And the US government stepped in and said, we will pay your government to bury everybody and to take care of everybody. And they said, nope. So they had to enlist the military to go in and treat this as a mass casualty situation, as if it was on US soil. And so they came in and kind of jumped in to take care of everybody. There was only a few autopsies done. The reports I read was only 7 of the bodies were autopsied, but they were all, let's see, let me go back to my notes. So they were collected by the US military, transported by cargo plane to Dover, to the Air Force Base. And they were handled there. And from there, they were fingerprinted, tried to identify people, processed all the bodies through. But that's an overwhelming, like it's such a huge number of deceased. I can't even imagine 100 deceased and having to handle that many coming in. So
Kari, most of these victims, most of these people were from Northern California. So it was thought at the beginning that they were going to fly them into Oakland Air Force Base, which had processed over 50,000 victims from Vietnam. But it wasn't the case. They went to Dover. But you were right. It was a military exercise to bring these people home. One of the facts that I remember, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but we all talked about how people are transported, and many of the things that we talk about, they're transported in what we call Ziegler cases, which is almost a hermetically sealed type of metal container. But there were only so many Ziegler cases on site, and they transported the deceased from the place of death to the airstrip where they were put into a different container, and these Ziegler cases were reused throughout. Only a little bit more than half were actually claimed by family members, which is unreal to me. But really? I'll let you take it. Yeah. I think 410 was the unclaimed amount. So just barely more than half.
So the one Time magazine, when they did the article, said by April of 79, more than 300 bodies of those followers had been claimed by family members, but at Dover, over 500 remained unclaimed, and over 200 were decomposed past the point of identification.
Oh my God.
And the problem was there were fees that if a family claimed them, they had to pay the military transport fees, and families didn't want to bring them home for private burial. So basically, it's kind of the same thing I think we see now with somebody going into the care of the medical examiner. And if they just say, okay, we're not going to take them from the medical examiner then contracts a funeral home to do the cremation at state cost. And then the person's cremated remains are handled from there. Sometimes the family gets them back, sometimes not. There is a huge mass grave in California that over 400 of the bodies were placed at. I'm assuming cremated. From the different stories, it didn't really say, but they did say a lot of area funeral homes, they kind of started divvying them up, like, okay, you take a couple, you take a couple, you take a couple, and just started handling them. And I'm guessing kind of a state was taking care of some of this and government was taking care of it, sort of thing.
I think it was Evergreen Cemetery was the name of the cemetery that
Yeah,
was finally used.
Yes, Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland.
Oakland, yeah. And then just recently, I mean, 7 years ago, 2014, there were 9 cremated remains of people who died at Jonestown that were found in a funeral home in Delaware that went out of business.
That's crazy.
Still, 7 years ago, it's still having, Wow.
But we all have that, where we all have cremated remains that nobody picks up. And if they were unclaimed then, like, what would they do? I would have thought they would have, I don't know, they would have had permission to bury them or do something. But some funeral homes don't want to do that with them. They'd rather just leave them in a closet than go bury them somewhere. What is the closest to this type of situation, a mass casualty that has hit home with you guys at all? Any type of a larger, like 5 to 20% death or anything?
I was going to say, I think the only thing for me would be a car accident.
Okay.
I think that's the only thing, that when you're dealing with 3 or 4 people from the same accident, the same family, things like that. I've never dealt with anything to this magnitude. Obviously, I don't think any of us have, but what an undertaking in a lot of ways, though. We were talking earlier about, some of the things that come into play. I think the chain of custody is immense here when it comes to human remains. How do you track that? Where's the paperwork go? Who's doing the paperwork? Who's typing? And now we've got computers. So I think that changes the whole dynamic. But it would be, it would almost have to be a fully functional funeral home to take care of this until it was done. With all their staff as they normally would. You know what I mean? It would just be an immense battle, I think. And then the elements that come into play too, weather-wise, that heat it just can't be good. It can't be good from a standpoint of decomposition. So.
Yeah. John.
But yeah, car accident for me. That's the closest I would ever be.
I'm looking at this one picture here of the article you sent us, and it literally shows an unidentified man who is stacking the aluminum coffins here. And you talking about the identification process, Ryan. It says on each one is 15B, one is 13B, one is 14B. So it's obvious that they had some type of chain of custody there. And one of them says Reverend Jimmy Jones right on there. So I think that's pretty neat. And the only thing I've ever dealt with, if there was anything mass going on, we did have a suicide. Sadly, we had a gentleman who killed his wife and then his son and then himself. And we had 3 caskets there for the funeral.
They put them all together for the funeral?
Sure did. It was pretty remarkable. As a matter of fact, Sam, the owner of the funeral home, was taking care of the family. I remember that morning that it happened. It just happened like at 7 a.m. Then a few hours later, we get the call that we're getting all 3 of the decedents. And then my boss calls me, and I'm an ordained minister. And so he says, John, can you officiate the service as well? And I'm like, okay. And so, what do I do with, the son is the one that's in charge, knowing that his mom has been murdered. His oldest brother has been murdered by his own dad, but yet he wanted all 3 caskets open. All 3 caskets were present. And I was wondering what I was going to say at that service, as all, wondering how it was going to be awkward or how the feelings were towards the dad, the husband who caused all this. And it was just remarkable how he was pretty much forgiven of everything, because they said it was just a heat of a moment of passion and they didn't want to erase his total memory of something horrendous that he even did. Of course, there was hard feelings there, but that's the only thing I've ever dealt with personally, was all 3 at the same time and at the same viewing and at the same service. And like Ryan said about a car accident, I've unfortunately seen, 5 caskets and even 6 caskets at a service before. So unless it's like a total tragedy of like, natural disaster of some sort, but this is on a totally different level of like a mass suicide. I mean, this is absolutely insane to think about this whole process here from a funeral director standpoint and embalmer standpoint, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, for me, Kari, I've not seen anything. I mean, not even close, and not even close to what John has experienced. So as a funeral director, I've kind of dodged it, for that matter. And I don't know what you do as a funeral director or a funeral home other than left foot, right foot, when you have more than one call in one family at one time. And this story is such a tragedy, though, that really, if you've seen the documentaries and you've really watched a lot of those, if you've got kids, then it's not easy. I can't even imagine.
Well, and that's what they said. This case really brought to light PTSD and what people who work in these type of situations, whether you're first responders, whether you're, people who care for the deceased, whether you're hospital workers, the military, the impact of seeing so many dead children, especially, just piled and piled and piled, and what they had to then carry with them the rest of their life. This was that big moment that it really brought to light what that did to people and how much it impacted them going forward, which is, I can't even imagine. I mean, that brings my thoughts to like Sandy Hook. That, to me, I can't imagine how those people sleep again, or how they do anything, having to walk into an elementary school with a massacre having happened. Like, that is one of those situations that oh my God, unbelievable. It's, to me, that's very different than where like a Columbine, where it's high schoolers, none less sad, but just different little bodies that have been riddled and killed and life taken. It's a little different than grown size bodies. I don't know if that makes any sense, but those scenarios, that's, I think, what they're asking about is some of those situations. How do we handle? And in those, it's not like you just go show up as a funeral director. The response people and the medical examiners, they all are the ones that are there kind of dealing, and we kind of wait for the calls from the family.
Yeah.
And we know they're coming, and it's like, you can't prepare for it, and you just wait until you're chosen by a family, because each family is going to choose their own funeral home in the area, or who they want to help them through that scenario. Kind of, the synagogue, I'm trying to think, the synagogue in, was it New York, that had the mass casualty as well? Was that like 5 years ago or 6 years ago? And
Pittsburgh?
Was it Pittsburgh?
I think so.
It was out east somewhere. I'm trying to I'm trying to think. That just popped in my mind too. And that, those type of scenarios where we're ready to help, but we have to wait until we're called by the family really to care for the person, and until we are called up by the family, then, unless it's a demort situation. Who wants to talk about demort?
When you asked about mass casualty situation, the funeral director that I worked with, that my mother and father purchased their funeral home from, he was involved with demort, in a demort situation. There was a massive plane crash in Indiana, up north, I think near Chicago, that type of area. And the local demort team was activated, and this funeral director, this friend of mine, left his business, left his family, and went to help. And when he got there, they were organized, and they scoured the field for, there's no pretty way to put it, just people, parts, and they would label and identify and leave and continue on, and they would go back and collect afterwards. And it's a very, very serious record keeping type of event, and it's a tough event that affects not just the families that lost their loved ones, but all those people that showed up to help.
Yeah, so it's the disaster is it disaster management occupational response team? What's the O?
Well, that's a good question now.
All of a sudden I'm
Let
blanking
me
on
look
it.
at it.
We're going to consult Dr. Google.
Yeah, thanks. But it's a team of people. There's a forensic
Disaster mortuary operational response team.
operational. So there's like a forensic dentist, and there's a forensic pathologist, and there's all these people, including the funeral directors, who are part of this team that respond to these scenarios to help care for the people. And like you said, the parts sometimes, and putting up the tents, bringing in the equipment, and facilitating taking care of everybody on site. And then from there, getting out to the individual funeral homes and the individual scenarios. I think the closest, so in our town, the thing that pops up in my mind a few years ago, it was the Uber killer in Kalamazoo. He was an Uber driver and just started driving around shooting people who called to get this Uber driver. And he killed some, I think it was women at a Cracker Barrel, and then he picked up a father and son and ended up shooting them, and like throughout the whole town just went around killing multiple people over the course of time, and just kind of did this massacre until they could catch him. But that's I feel like the biggest, that's the thing that's popping in my mind of recent, I guess, here in the area that has really happened. But, and again, those families each called their own individual funeral home, and after the medical examiner handled the deceased, they were released to the funeral home, and the funeral home handled them and went from there. I'm going back.
I think Brian brings up a good point. One of the bigger things I think that gets overlooked in these situations is the mass amount of documentation that comes into play, so Brian hit on that a little bit, but I don't know that gets talked about enough. And I keep reading in that article, they talk about the ancillary staff. And I think that goes overlooked a lot when it comes to these situations, because anytime you've got a mass casualty situation, there's paperwork that follows everybody.
Yeah.
And it has to be that way there, but it's just tough too, I think, to keep everything straight. And back then, like we've talked about, everything was typed or it was written. It wasn't something you could just save to a flash drive and move forward with. So,
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So it's obviously a lot different, but yeah, I think that's something that's big. So,
yeah.
And the lengths that they go to as well. It's just amazing how thorough DMORD and all these rescue teams are, not just from the paperwork standpoint and the documentation, but they exhaust all of their resources to search and to find, and if they find any tissue, any type of human remains, I mean, they make sure it's labeled, they make sure they mark the spot, they have all of that written down, and they do their best to identify that one little piece as well, if they can match it with anybody, just to make sure that one piece of tissue that's a human remain belongs to the right person. It's fascinating to me how well organized and thought out and thorough that they are, for sure.
Well, and because that one piece might be the only piece they get back. So they treat every little piece as if that might be the only thing a family gets. And
such dignity and such honor. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and I think we saw that, Matt, on the biggest level on 9/11 and how everything was handled there. And we talked about that, I think, in the last video we did about some of that, is some of the unrecognized. Well, what did we do? The last disarticulated bodies and things, and kind of if you find parts later and what happens. We talked about that in the last victim video. So I know this was a big one though that people wanted us to talk about, was Jonestown and the decomposition. And there was really, by the point they got to Dover, they were so far gone that you really couldn't have done much after having laid outside in the sun for a week, having been in those cases in transport and the heat, and then maybe the first ones that were dealt with, but then how long did it take to process 918 bodies? Like,
yeah.
Wow.
Yep. Kari, if I could say this though, I think generally from an outsider standpoint, what do you expect your funeral director and embalmer to say in this type of situation? And in my opinion, and I could be wrong, but I'm probably die on this hill, that I will not tell you anything for sure until your loved one is in my care.
Yeah.
And once they're in my care, I can do that pre-embalming analysis. And that pre-embalming analysis may not lead to embalming, but
Right.
it tells me, can I embalm? and what methods am I going to employ to make this opportunity for you to see your loved one possible. And we will go to all lengths. We will create new methods. We will do whatever we can. I'll call Farmer John down in the Carolinas there and have him talk me through what he would think. And that's what we do as funeral directors.
Yeah.
We have friends. We call people, and
Yeah.
you know, the answer is never no until we can't even create a new method.
Right. Till you try. You don't know until you try.
You don't know.
And it's amazing what we can do. And we don't know all the answers, but sometimes it's MacGyvering our way through a scenario and like, oh my gosh, this worked. Like, look what I got us an extra couple days, or, you know, whatever the scenario or situation. But like you said, and I think we've said in past videos, until we get them, until we give them a bath, until we can actually physically ourselves see them wash away some of the blood and the debris and things. I think we talked about that in the Catherine Peterson case, that until you get through that layer of stuff that the medical examiner doesn't wash off, we really don't know what's under there to deal with.
The key is that you try if you can. And before even Undertaking the Podcast was thought of, Ryan and I were embalming together, sharing ideas together. And two of our first cases were people that have been dead for over 10 days, over 21 days. Both of us were able to put our heads together and to make a viewing possible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not perfect, but we did our best. And it became not an option that police and coroner and everyone told the family, absolutely not. When Ryan and I were able to put our heads together, we went from maybe not to, yeah, we can.
Don't tell us no.
Exactly.
That's when Ryan got on the phone and called the coroners and be like, stay in your lane. Stay in your lane.
You are 100% correct on that. And I am 100% agreement with everything John just stated.
Good job, Farmer John. God, I love his overalls.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you guys for joining for another video. Thank you, everybody. Check out Ryan and Brian, even though my fingers aren't going to be pointing in the right directions. Check out Ryan and Brian at Undertaking the Podcast on any podcast platform. And just check out John anytime over here on one of my videos. John's awesome. He's so fun. So thanks, everyone. And we'll see you.
Yes, he is. John is a good time.
You
No
love
question.
John. No knucklehead embalmers. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.